Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Shifting the Narrative to Advance Racial Equity. For those of you who are returning GrantSpace webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm very glad that you're joining us. My name is Julieta Mendez, and I'm the Director of Programs for Candid, based out of New York City. And I will be supporting today's webinar with the help of my colleague, Elizabeth Civada, Program Associate, also joining me here in New York. We will be fielding the questions that you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. Before we get started, there's some important news we want to share with you, especially with those of you that are joining us for the first time. You might have heard that we joined forces with GuideStar to form a new single organization called Candid. Together, we have over 85 years of expertise in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world, and Candid finds out where that money comes from and where it goes and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector and by the sector. Candid enables nonprofits, foundations, donors, and the public to be on the same page. Candid services for nonprofits include the information and tools that you have come to rely on from Foundation Center, and we're also working on new products and new ways to serve you better. In 2019, we will be investing more deeply in the Funding Information Network partner sites so that we can provide localized training and access to you right where you are. If you haven't heard about our Funding Information Network, we invite you to go to grantspace.org where you can learn more. As Candid, we will continue to deliver all the great online trainings and the self-paced e-learning courses that we are known for, as well as our wonderful in-person programming. So please do stay connected. With Candid, you can explore to find funding with Foundation Directory Online, as well as strengthen and improve your nonprofit by creating a GuideStar nonprofit profile and by participating in grants-based training to move your fundraising skills to the next level. As a service of Candid, GrantSpace offers you the ability to see which of our partner sites is closest to you and to view our training calendar for 2019. And check out candid.org to learn more about our new organization. Even though we are starting a new chapter as a new organization, you will still see some existing Foundation Center branding over the next few months. And now, without further ado, I want to turn the controls over to our presenters, Alan Jenkins, so he can display his presentation. And as he takes the reins, I'd like to introduce him. So Alan Jenkins is president and co-founder of the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communication lab dedicated to the idea that the United States can and should be a place where everyone enjoys full and equal opportunity. Before joining the Opportunity Agenda, Alan was Director of Human Rights at the Ford Foundation, managing grant making in the US and 11 overseas regions. He is a frequent commentator in broadcast and print media, including MSNBC, CNN, The New York Times, and The Huffington Post. Alan's other positions have included lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry A. Blackmun, law clerk to U.S. District Court Judge Robert L. Carter, and coordinator of the Access to Justice Project of the American Civil Liberties Union. Alan serves on the Ad Council's Advisory Committee on Public Issues, and as an advisor on poverty to the JBP Foundation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Julieta. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. Well, thank you for that very gracious, very long, very gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Elizabeth and Candid and also to Borealis. It's terrific to be able to share some of what we're learning. And as you said, we'll leave time for discussion. And I think there are a lot of folks on the call with some great experience in this area. So hopefully people will also share their own insights. That's me. I could have sworn I had more hair than that, but pictures don't lie. It's great once again to be with you. And as you all heard, the Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. So we use communication and culture to move hearts, minds, and policy towards greater and more equal opportunity. And we do that deeply embedded and within the ecosystem of change makers in the field, advocates and policymakers, organizers, faith leaders, business leaders, and many others, and certainly funders and foundations, as well as artists and creatives. All of our work is done primarily behind the scenes, but it's all done in collaboration with leaders around the country and for free to them. So our model as a nonprofit is to raise money from foundations and individuals so that we can work with all kinds of allies strategically and without them having to expend those resources. Some of the things that we do are collaborative strategy, as I described, working with coalitions and movements and organizations to develop out their narrative change and communication strategies. Research, and by that I mean communications research, so public opinion research, researching social media trends, looking at news coverage, and also at popular culture trends. For example, a recent report we did was on media, or I should say television coverage, television programming around immigrants and immigration. So this is fictional television on cable, on the broadcast networks, and on streaming services, and the news was not good. So our work then is to improve perceptions and narratives around those issues through the other strategies that are described here. Framing and messaging advice to the field through tools and communications training, and that includes a steady stream of messaging, advice, and guidance. Hopefully many of you on the call today are recipients of our resources and e-blasts, and if you're not, hopefully you'll sign up. We provide free communications training for coalitions and leaders and advocates. We place leaders in the media with an emphasis on people with lived experience on issues like poverty or immigration or the criminal justice system. And as noted, we work with pop culture leaders and creatives because we find that they can reach audiences that are much bigger, and often they can inspire in a different way than many of us as advocates can. That picture of Jimmy Fallon that you probably can't see is actually the program that we did, a discussion guide for Kerry Washington's recent play, American Son. That's one example of how we work with creatives. So now you know who we are. You can find all of our resources, as can your grantees, on our website, opportunityagenda.org. And I hope you'll sign up for our resource, the AMP, which is specifically on issues of racial justice and economic justice, including breaking news and helping communicators to prepare to make the most of a very tumultuous public discourse. So the reason we're here today, as all of you, I'm sure, know, communication matters very much in moving hearts, minds, and policy, in changing practices, in affecting how we think about the issues and how we treat each other. And so thinking about all of the images that represent movements you see here on your screen, marriage equality, Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, the gun safety movement, Me Too, and Fight for 15, advocacy and litigation and research and organizing are all critical parts of the progress that's been made there, and strategic, thoughtful communication that has changed the narrative on how we think about these issues. So communication matters, and that is particularly true on issues of racial equity and other kinds of equity and inclusion. In our world, there tend to be four types of communications that those of us in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy are working on. The first is branding. So branding is making sure that your audiences know who you are, what you stand for. It's important for fundraising, but also for political power, for bringing in new members, for making sure that your communications and advocacy can be heard and effective, but it's only one kind of communication. A second kind is campaign communications. That's typically the 50% plus one, right? So what's the media strategy, for instance, to defeat a ballot initiative or to move a proposition or to win an election or to advance a cause? That tends to be short term. It tends to be time limited. And again, it is just one very important type of communication. A third is crisis communications. So if you're lucky, you will not have to deal with crisis communications, but if you're making an impact in the world, you're going to have to deal with crisis communications. And so think on the one hand of Planned Parenthood. They probably have the best crisis communications operation in the nonprofit world. They're continually under attack by opponents, and they are very adept at mobilizing and telling their story and their supporters and their audiences to survive and thrive over time. By contrast, many of you will remember Acorn, an organization of organizers that was very influential, very important, and went out of business as a result of mostly unfair and some accurate attacks. And in our view, we're not prepared with a crisis communications approach. So that's a third very important type of communications. But in our view, the most important category is the long-term moving of hearts and minds. Because when you get that right, when you tell that story well, all these other types of communications begin to fall into line. You know what your brand is and how to communicate it. You'll adopt communications, campaign communications that are advancing your long-term as well as your short-term interests. In a crisis, people will know who you are and what you stand for. So what is this idea of narrative? The notion and the word narrative have become very popular in the nonprofit and philanthropic world. I'm glad of that, since when we used to talk about narrative, we got a lot of funny looks and nobody knew what we were talking about. But it's also the case that definitions vary widely, and some people use the term to mean lots of different things. Here's our definition. Narrative is a big story rooted in shared values and themes that influences how people process information and make decisions. And that's really important, right? Facts matter, data matters, but audiences are invulnerable to facts that don't fit within a set of values and a story, a narrative that they can understand and connect to. And so the image represented here immediately brings to mind the David and Goliath story, or the little guy up against insurmountable odds, right? We don't have to tell you who's the hero, who's the villain, who you're supposed to be rooting for. That is a familiar story that has been handed down over the ages. It's just one of many examples of a big story rooted in shared values and themes that influences how we process the information that we have and make decisions about it. Narratives spread in lots of different ways in the political discourse, the news media, social media, certainly through entertainment, but also in houses of worship, in popular culture, in games, in sitting around with the dinner table or the water cooler. And so we need to be thinking about all of those different ways in which narratives are generated and in which they can change. Why do narratives matter? Because the vast majority of our audiences, and this is especially true on issues of racial equity, are carrying around at least two stories, two narratives in their heads. And the one that is more powerful often determines how they interpret the facts and make decisions. Almost everyone at some level is carrying around a set of values and narrative that's on racial equity and lots of other issues that is about personal responsibility, that if outcomes are unequal, it's because some people aren't working hard enough, that is thinking about us versus them, and is motivated in some ways by fear and stereotypes. And virtually all of us are also carrying around a competing narrative that is about the value of equal opportunity that's widely shared in our country, about the fact that if outcomes are unequal, there may well be unequal obstacles that are holding some groups, some people back. Community, that we're all in it together, and that diversity is one of our greatest strengths as a nation. And believe it or not, although it doesn't always feel that way in a polarized electorate, almost everyone, almost all of the audiences that we need to persuade are carrying around both of those stories. And our job, at least insofar as we're advancing equity goals, is to highlight that second story on the right and remind people that that is actually the story that should motivate our public decisions and public policies. Unfortunately, we're up against a lot of harmful narratives around issues of race and identity, and that's especially true in the entertainment world and in the public discourse, and all of these images represent types of stereotypes that get replicated and that have their own narratives in the public discourse. And we also have some positive ones. This is one of our Olympic teams that shows how diversity in our country has allowed us to thrive and achieve amazing things, bringing together different skills and experiences. And there are many other examples of that. And we need to be aware as we go through the world of what narratives help us, what narratives are perhaps holding us back. It's also true, and this is especially true for those of you who are funders who are working across movements, that there are ways of helping to drive and change narratives. And so this is a wheel, we call this the narrative wheel at the Opportunity Agenda, because it's cyclical. It involves beginning a process with the values and goals and priorities of the field, including people who are directly affected by the issues. It has to be informed by communications research so that we have a better understanding of our audiences and where they're coming from and where we can lead them. It needs to be part of a participatory process in which lots of people are adding their voices and testing and asking questions and rejecting things that are not resonant. It needs to be translated into communications tools and training, support, and infrastructure. And it needs to be implemented and observed and evaluated. And through that knowledge from practical experience and formal evaluation, we need to be returning to our communities and our movements to further improve the narrative. And sometimes big things happen out in the world that require a revamping. So think about human rights. I used to be the director of human rights at the Ford Foundation. I assumed that position 3 weeks before 9/11, 2001. And so as you can imagine, the story of human rights, especially in the United States, changed radically, and our strategy for telling our story had to change radically because of that monumental and tragic occurrence. So let's get specific. What are some of the lessons that we have learned for talking about issues of racial equity? And there are 10, and I think we'll have time to get through all of them, and then we'll have some Q&A, and I want to give you some practical tips and examples for how to move this forward. So the first is engaging strategic audiences. It's very important for us to be thinking about who are our priority folks to be moved, whether to be activated or persuaded or otherwise, and what are they thinking and how can we connect with them? So often, you hear people say, well, we got to get better at reaching the general public. One thing you should take from this presentation is that there's no such thing as the general public. None of us have the resources to reach everyone, and the good news is we don't have to in order to be successful. Even Coke and Pepsi don't have the resources to reach everyone in the public. So we need to be much more strategic. So what does that mean as a practical matter? A couple of ways of thinking about strategic audiences. One is in terms of decision makers on the one hand and influencers on the other. So decision makers are people who can get you the outcome that you want. They have the power to make the decision. They might be policymakers, boards of directors, sometimes they're voters or even consumers, or young people who you want to convince to stop smoking. But they might also be influencers. So often we don't have the ability to reach and persuade and sustainably persuade people who are making decisions that we care about. And so we're having to go to the people who those decision makers listen to, whether it's their constituents, faith leaders, editorial boards, shareholders. It could be lots of different folks, and that requires some research and inquiry. This group in the center, in case you hadn't guessed, swing voters, right? Okay, I don't make them up, I just put them on a slide. Okay, here's the second way of thinking about strategic audiences, which is activating your base, persuading the undecided, and marginalizing the influence of your opponents. So think about your audiences in terms of a scale of 1 to 5. The ones are people who are already with you. They agree with you 99% of the time, but inevitably they're not doing everything that you would like to see them do. So your job is to activate them. The 5s are the people who are against you. They're working to undermine your goals. You're somebody else's 5, right, on the issues you care about. So by their nature, we can't persuade them. That's what makes them a 5. And so our goal with them is to try to prevent them from influencing everybody else. So those 2s, 3s, and 4s, the vast majority in most instances of your audience, are people who you're trying to persuade. The 2s are easier to persuade, right? They're mostly with you. The 3s are in the middle, and the 4s are the hardest. They're the skeptics, but they're reachable. And so you need to be thinking both about that first example, right? Decision makers and influencers, and thinking of those folks in terms of their persuadability and the extent to which you want to activate or simply push back against their influence. So this is from some research that we did recently on issues of diversity and support for racial equity. This is a nationwide poll with lots of questions and oversampling of a number of racial and ethnic communities. And what we found was good news, that actually 33% of the U.S. public, of U.S. adults, it's actually higher among younger folks, strongly embrace diversity. They believe it helps us solve problems. They see discrimination in daily life, and they believe it's a problem. And they see a strong role for government in ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity. And this, you see at the bottom some of the demographics. They're more likely to be of those groups. But that doesn't mean they're mostly African American, for example, or mostly younger Americans. They're not, although a majority are women. But those groups are overrepresented. And 33% of the base is a great place to start. The opposition we found was only 17% of the U.S. electorate, or U.S. adults, pardon me. These are folks who are either ambivalent or they're actively concerned about diversity and not supportive of equity. They believe government assistance and civil rights laws have created a culture of dependency. They believe minorities, that's the language that tends to be used amongst this segment, use racism as an excuse, or claims of racism as an excuse for unequal effort or unequal talent. And they're more likely to be from these demographic groups that you see at the bottom. So that's a pretty small group to be the hardcore opposition. And then the rest are persuadables. So these are folks who we consider to be cross-pressured. They're thinking about and hold both sets of views. And it's important for us to understand that they are, toggling back and forth from one narrative to another. And so crucial that we are thinking of them in that way. They mostly look like the United States, slightly higher percentage of Latinx folks in this group than in the other groups, than they are represented in the larger population. So what's the second? First lesson was understanding your audience. Second is leading with shared values. In our sector, we like to start with policies. Let me tell you about 3 strikes and why it's terrible. Let me tell you about, the Affordable Care Act. And so policies are important, but most people are not closely following policies the way we are. So you go home for Thanksgiving, your family asks you, what are you working on? And you're saying, well, I'm, really concerned about, the effects of the 1994 crime bill and the way in which mandatory minimums are, right? And already your audience is, your uncle or aunt is turning away from you to talk to a cousin, right? Because it's not engaging to them and it's not familiar. So the next level up is issues, right? I want to talk to you about police violence or drug policy or healthcare. And so your audiences are going to recognize those issues, but they're also not coming with a blank slate when it comes to issues of equity in particular. They're maybe thinking about, you talk to someone about education, they're thinking about their teacher who they loved or their kid's teacher who they love or, are angry with. They're maybe thinking about those property taxes they just had to pay, and it's frustrating for them, and you're not starting in the same place. So 9 times out of 10, we recommend starting with shared values. I want to talk to you about the importance of equal justice in our criminal justice system. I want to talk to you about equal educational opportunity and why that's in the interest of our nation as well as individual children, right? And that shared values piece is important. So you're not leading with the values that only you hold. You're thinking about your audience, what do they care about, and you're also upholding values that are important to you. So these are some of the values, and you'll be getting this PowerPoint. This is based on our research, but also lots and lots of research from lots of other folks. These are some of the values that have proven most important in building public support for racial equity, as well as support for diversity, which are, of course, 2 different things. Okay, so what's number 3? Telling a systemic story. This is really important. So individual stories really matter, but remember that the narrative we're trying to establish, the vast majority of issues around racial equity, and particularly those that we tend to work on, those of us in the social change and philanthropic sector, are actually about systemic causes or solutions. And so if all of our stories are highly individualized, we're playing into that other narrative where people tend to blame folks who they think of as unsuccessful for lack of effort, for lack of work, for making bad choices, for so-called culture, right? And so we need to be telling the systemic story of systemic problems and obstacles as well as solutions. And we need to find lots of ways to do that. So, this is one example. This is a map created by the Kirwan Institute, which maps out places, this is Baltimore, greater Baltimore, places where there is high opportunity because of quality schools and healthcare and jobs and environmental conditions, as well as low opportunity, the light shaded area, because of the opposite, right? Under-resourced schools and lack of affordable housing and the like. And so you see that where most people of color live in Baltimore is actually the lowest opportunity region of Baltimore. And so you begin to be able to tell the story of the obstacles that folks are up against. This is just one way of doing that. But importantly, people do want human stories, right? And that's why most of us go into this work, because we care about the human aspect of the work that we're doing. And so there are a couple of different categories of stories, of human stories, that can also drive systemic thinking and the kind of narrative that we want. One category is called enlightened insiders. These are people who are inside systems where they're reaching lots of different folks. They're seeing lots of different people on a day-to-day basis that causes them to identify a systemic problem. So on the left, we see Will Smith portraying the doctor who discovered the concussion epidemic and brain injury epidemic in the NFL. Right? He was an individual, his story is compelling, but he also recognized that there's a systemic problem. We also work with prosecutors and law enforcement who are supportive of criminal justice reform, for example, from a racial equity standpoint, because they're seeing lots of the same problem, and their personal story of evolution and change is also a systemic story. The other category is what we call affected change agents. These are people who are directly affected by a problem, and the problem that they identify and the action that they take is itself systemic. So Rosa Parks, right? We all know that her act of courageously refusing to give up her seat on the bus was part of an organized campaign. It was a systemic problem that they identified of racial segregation throughout the South and ultimately throughout the nation. And her individual story, compelling as it was also a systemic story. Jose Antonio Vargas, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, also an undocumented immigrant who has become a leader and a storyteller for why the Dreamers are facing systemic challenges that require a systemic solution. And Emma Gonzalez, who was one of the victims of the Parkland, Florida shootings, and has become a spokesperson, not just for her own story, but for the challenges facing lots and lots of young people and other Americans of gun violence and the failure of gun safety provisions. Okay, number 4, especially important in the racial context, talking about obstacles before outcomes. So remember that often when you share only an unequal outcome, so for example, here we see the African American unemployment rate is twice the white rate in both weak and strong economies. That's true. Our economy is strong now. The black unemployment rate is twice the white rate. It was true in the depths of the Great Recession. But many of your persuadable audiences will assume not that that's because of discrimination, but that that's because black folks aren't working hard enough. They're, we have, cultural obstacles. We don't show up to work on time. All of those cultural stereotypes, false and unfair stereotypes, can come flooding in with your audiences, especially if they're 3s and 4s on our scale. So remember to talk first about some of the unequal obstacles. So this is something from our wonderful colleague, Diva Pager, who passed away recently. A study that she did, she found that resumes with names like Emily and Brendan received significantly more calls from employers than did identical resumes with names like Lakeisha and Jamal. Right, so that we're identifying one of many, many unequal obstacles, and then we're talking about the unequal employment rate, which flows not only from that obstacle, but from many others, right? So we're telling the story of unequal opportunity that leads to unequal outcomes. Number 5 is acknowledging the progress. So recognizing that we need to, for persuadable audiences, especially kind of 3s and 4s, to make sure we are acknowledging that our nation has made progress over the years, and that in some ways there is greater equality of opportunity, and then immediately reminding them that we have a long way left to go. That has tended to be an easier story to tell, even with skeptics in the last couple of years than it was during the Obama years, but it's still really important because folks will tend to focus on the episodic example of a person of color who has been successful, overcome the odds, to say that we're now post-racial. So acknowledging that we've made progress helps them to put their guard down, right? Okay, we're not debating about whether anything's changed. We're debating about whether there is more that we can do. So especially with skeptics, that's important. 6, emphasize solutions. Really, really important. We have an expression at the Opportunity Agenda that there's a reason why Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest speech was not called, "I have a complaint." Right? We forget that all the time. We need to convey the positive vision that we're after, solutions that work. It helps people Americans right now are in no mood to hear about another problem that can't be solved, right? So they need to know what we're for, what can be done, what's worked in the past, and what perhaps is completely new that we're proposing. And it needs to have a connection to the values, the shared values that we identified, and the systemic problem that we've described to them. So talk about solutions. And in some ways, this is one of the most, after leading with values, this is the most important point, is not only talking about the problem, which as a recovering civil rights lawyer, I am very familiar with, but making sure we also talk about what we're for. 7 is showing how equal opportunity benefits all of us. So we want to be talking about the injustice and the harm to people who are directly affected by racial inequity and other forms of unequal opportunity. We also want to remind folks that we are all better off when there is full and equal opportunity. One way of doing this is through what we call a contribution model. This is an excerpt from the All-In Nation report that was done by PolicyLink, where they use an example of what, in 2011, which was right before the report came out, if we had had equal economic opportunity along the indices that they identify, what would our GDP look like? It would be $1.2 trillion higher. How many more people would have moved out of poverty? What would our tax revenues have looked like? So, and it doesn't always have to be as transactional as that. It could simply be we'd be better at solving problems. We'd have more doctors serving communities and finding cures for diseases, right? We would be better as a people and as a nation if everyone had access to full and equal opportunity. That's a part of the solution piece that's really important. 8 is a positive role for government. So, especially now, including for our base, it can be easy to bash government all the time and to always be pointing to government as a source of problems and not solutions. But for the vast majority of us, the solutions that we're advocating require a positive role for government. And so if all we've been doing is tearing down government, and our opponents are doing the same, by the way, then when we come to our solution, folks aren't with us. Right? They're not willing to support our solution or to believe that it's possible because all we've told them is about how government is a problem. And so Americans really they're skeptical, they're cynical about government, but they also strongly support a positive role for government in the ways that are set out on this slide. They recognize that it's a way that we come together to solve common problems, to plan for the future. They see that it's important to make and enforce fair rules, that corporations won't do that individuals won't do that we need public structures to do that, to protect the public, for whether it's food safety or federal aviation and airplanes, or it's the way in which communities are policed. And the importance of preserving the pathways to full and equal opportunity. And so we need to talk about that. We absolutely need to critique the actions of governmental entities and policies that are harmful, and we need to be specific about that, right? It's a politician that's taking an action, or it's a policy that is wrong-headed, or it's an enforcement effort that is harmful, but let's not just talk about government being the problem. Let's make sure we're articulating a positive role, role for government as well. Okay, 9 is to avoid myth busting, and this one can be very hard because there are all kinds of falsehoods and misdirections and sometimes outright lies that we hear from folks who we're up against, or just that get perpetrated in the media, or especially in social media. And so it's tempting, especially for somebody like me who's a former litigator, to say, well, let me tell you this myth and then let me debunk it and explain to you why it's wrong. There's a ton of research showing that when you state a myth and then you debunk the myth and you come back to your audience 2 weeks later, they remember the myth. And for many of them, they hadn't heard the myth before, right? And so you're telling it to them for the first time. You're doing your opponent's work for them. So these are 2 examples of that we would recommend against, but there are a ton of these examples. So before you start to explain, well, let me tell you why immigrants actually do pay taxes. You probably heard that they don't. Let's talk instead about the ways in which our nation benefits from immigrants and immigration, the creation of jobs, the creation of businesses, the many, many people, immigrants who are paying taxes, some of which they will never benefit from if they're undocumented, right? Let's tell the affirmative story and not repeat the myth from the other side. And then 10 is calling for action. So your grantees, others should never deliver a message, never speak to an audience without asking them to do something. Right? It might be a light ask, like I asked you all to go sign up to receive the AMP, our action alert system at opportunityagenda.org, or you might ask them something, a heavier ask, turn out for this demonstration or protest, contact your member of Congress, write this letter, speak out, speak out in the workplace, etc. You're going to determine that based in part on that scale of your audience of 1 to 5. If they're your hardcore base, then you want to be thinking about, okay, how can I motivate them, support them, inspire them to take a significant action because they already agree with me. If they're 4s, maybe all you're asking them to do is to learn more. Right? To learn more, go to our website. Maybe you're asking them to read this article from a neutral source that you think will be more likely to convince them. But we should always be asking our audiences for something. Okay, so that is the 10 lessons. I'm going to give you a tool for bringing all of that together in developing messages that are consistent with these narrative principles on issues of equity. And then we're going to take some questions and have some discussion. And some of you are familiar with this tool from the Opportunity Agenda, which is structuring messages in terms of value, problem, solution, and action. And this is based on not only research, communications research, but just a ton of practical experience and a decade, actually 13 years of our organization working with VPSA, as we call it, with thousands of communicators around the country and getting just fantastic feedback about this tool. So the value is, why should your audience care, right? What do you and your audience share as a value? Equal opportunity, the value of an education, the idea that we're all in it together, community, right? Pragmatism, that we should prevent problems before they become bigger ones. what is the problem, which is essentially how are we falling short of that value, and why should we care, right? What harm is it causing us? What are you for? That solution, right? I have a dream, not I have a complaint. And then the action. What can your audience concretely do? So I'm going to give you one example of this, but on our website, we have a ton more. And we actually have at the bottom of, I think, almost every page on our website, access to a VPSA generator. So if you're about to do an interview or you're going to give a speech or what have you, you can actually go to this resource and create it's a series of prompts. You can create your own value, problem, solution, action message. You can save it as a PDF. You can print it out. We really, urge you to take advantage of that because it's a great resource, and then share it with us. If it works, let us know. If it fell flat, let us know that, and we can learn from your positive or negative experience. So let's take a look at an example here. Every child deserves an equal opportunity to achieve their dreams, no matter their skin color, accent, or zip code. So this is the value of equal opportunity and the idea that everyone should be able to fully realize their full self. But here's the problem. Our country has made great strides breaking down barriers of discrimination, right? That's acknowledging the progress. But still today, racial bias and discrimination keep too many people out of networks of opportunity connected to where you live, like quality schools, good jobs, parks, and hospitals that help you make a better life for your family, right? This is actually tested language that we used around an issue of fair housing. So you've acknowledged the progress, you've stated the shared value, you've acknowledged the progress, you've explained the problem. Here's the solution. We need strong laws that connect people, provide equal opportunity, and dismantle patterns of segregation and discrimination wherever they exist. So the solution connects back to the value in the problem. It's systemic, as was the problem. And here the action is tell the City Council to adopt a fair housing ordinance that fosters diverse, prosperous communities. So you see how the action is looping back, right, to that value. So this is just one of probably 10,000 examples that we have used over the years. This is one that we actually tested with both the base and the persuadables and was very effective. This was around the time that the U.S. Supreme Court was considering whether the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits only intentional discrimination or also what's called disparate impact discrimination that has the effect of excluding or segregating people, whether or not that was intentional or whether or not there's current intentional discrimination. And so the court upheld that, Justice Kennedy being the swing vote, but we also were able to work with allies around the country to build support for that outcome. And this was one of the messages that we used to do that. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to return the screen to our hosts, and I look forward to hearing and taking your questions. And my action, I'm going to urge you one more time, go to opportunityagenda.org. We have dozens of free racial equity and other social justice communications tools and resources and research, and you can also sign up to receive the AMP and our other sources every month. All right. I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. First of all, just thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. I was taking copious notes here. There's a lot to learn. So now we're going to begin answering your questions, the questions of the audience. We have a couple questions here submitted already from two of our participants. Jonathan, he wants to know, he says, I'm starting a new racial justice equity organization in Florida. As a Caucasian person, I'm having trouble gaining the trust of the African and the Caribbean American communities that I am aiming to help. How can I make inroads into these communities? Alan, your thoughts on that?
Sure. So, and thanks, Jonathan. And I think that's partly a communications question, and it's partly kind of an organizing and ally question, right? How can I be a good ally and, pardon me, and how do I organize? And so, I think the first thing is, my first part of my answer is an organizing answer, which is show up and support the organizations and people who are already there on the ground. I'm not sure what part of Florida you're in, Jonathan, but there are some remarkable racial justice and equity organizations in Florida. I'll just name one, which is Dream Defenders, which was created in the aftermath of the Trayvon Martin, the killing of Trayvon Martin and the exoneration, the acquittal of George Zimmerman. When we started the Opportunity Agenda 13 years ago, the first thing we did was sit in rooms with lots and lots of the people who we wanted to support and listen to what their needs were, what they were doing, and how we could help. And so that is a communication skill. It's not a messaging skill in the first instance, right? It's a communication skill, but it's also kind of an organizing skill of conveying that I support you. I have my own goals, and I want to work in a way that will help and support you. That's the best way to build trust in any relationship, where you're new to, or you're newly bringing an organizational lens, at least, to a conversation that's been had for a long time, and where people have been burned many, many times, right, by new organizations saying that they're there to help, and then being exploitative or not listening or trying to run everything. And so, I would say that that's the most important thing. And then, the other thing I would say is that you will likely be able to reach some audiences that some of the existing groups are not able to reach, and vice versa. And so, partnering as well as support to be able to bring in some insights about, for example, audiences that they're perhaps have been trying to reach for a long time, that maybe you have more trust with already, can be a really important way to collaborate, to try to move forward together, rather than just a transactional relationship. So those are my initial thoughts there.
Thank you so much, Alan. The next question is from Holly, and she wants to know if the research around entrenching myths is specific to race myths, or is that consistent across subject areas?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that. No, it's not specific to race myths. In fact, a lot of the initial research came in the context of vaccinations. Right. So as you all know, there's a robust debate. I'm on the side of science on this debate, but there's a robust debate about whether vaccines cause illness, or whether they're crucial to preventing illness, or both. And what that research found was that telling people, hey, you may have heard that vaccines cause autism, but they don't, and let me explain the science to you, all that, they would come back to people 2 weeks later, and most of them would remember the link between autism and vaccinations, which does not in fact exist according to science. So the research came from there and from suicide prevention, but it has been since replicated in lots of other contexts that are on point regarding race and diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Alan. We have several questions coming in. Aisha wants to know, are there unique communication strategies an organization should consider if their work focuses on equity and young children that range from the ages of 3 to 8?
So probably is my answer. I maybe don't have quite enough information, but I'm assuming, Aisha, that your audience is not, for a communication standpoint, your audience is not these very young children, but rather, their parents, decision makers at schools, in the educational infrastructure, lawmakers, et cetera. And I think that, unfortunately, an important thing to remember is that some of us tend to think that, kind of leading with children and the idea that children are our future is going to be especially impactful. But what we've found is that the stereotypes about our young kids of color are often so entrenched that it shifts very quickly to blame, right? Well, the parents, bad parenting. Those kids are, ill-behaved, they're dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And so, certainly we need to talk about that idea that children are vulnerable and starting out in life, and they are also crucial to our future as families, communities, and our nation. But we also need to be talking about the values underlying the thing we're hoping to achieve. So if it's, universal pre-K, for example, talking about the idea that getting starting out in life in a way that ensures that you are well prepared, well fed, ready to learn is crucial for all of us. It's something that we all want for our kids, and that benefits all of us. And so, I'm riffing here a little bit because I don't know, Aisha, exactly what policies you're advocating for, but just recognizing those embedded stereotypes, and that you need to have kind of like a multifaceted communication strategy in dealing with young kids, as with almost all of these issues.
Thank you, Alan. And Aisha, we do invite you to follow up on your question if you want to clarify maybe a little bit more about what your work is, what your work focuses on. We invite you to submit an additional question. The next question that we have here is from Allison, and she is tuning in and has the grant writer's perspective. And what she's sharing with us is that her agency is working to make sure that they're writing grants from a strengths-based perspective that honors their clients' experience. And they also want to make sure that their narratives are something that their clients are proud to read about themselves, while also letting funders who she indicates here, who are often coming from a deficit-based perspective, letting them know that their programs are matching their goals, right? She wants to know if you have any suggestions or resources for doing this.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts, Allison. One is that value problem solution action structure is really helpful for addressing just that problem that you're describing, right? The disconnect between we want to talk about strengths and value add, and often our audiences are more receptive in the first instance to deficit. So talking about that value, I will pick one, but you'll need to look more specifically, that equal educational opportunity is crucial for all of us, and to get a fresh start. And when we do so, right, this is where you get to talk about why it's important. When we do so, we see from practical experience that, and then you know best in your community what you see as the benefits, but it could be our workforce grows and is strengthened, or it could be every child is equipped to achieve their full potential, or it could be we're healthier as a community, or what have you. And then obviously the action in this instance is the solution is you, right? The solution is the work that your organization is doing, and the action is funding that work. But crucially, and I'm sure you know this as a grant writer, the first step is to look at the way in which the foundation talks about its work, or the funder talks about its values and work. So some foundations come at the same work, same issues from a racial equity standpoint, or from a public health standpoint, or from an educational standpoint, or from a data and science standpoint, a research standpoint. Your work is what it is, right? But you have to be fluent enough to be able to emphasize the part of your work that is most resonant with the funder. And typically, the funder's values will also be embedded in their communications. Sometimes it's grant guidelines, usually not. Sometimes it's their website. But I'm also looking, when we write a grant, I'm looking at, well, okay, how is the CEO of this foundation out in the world talking about this? When they get quoted, or when they give a speech, or what have you, what values are they lifting up? When they do talk about contribution model rather than deficit model, what are they pointing to? What do they seem to be most proud of that their foundation has accomplished over the years? And that process, which is the same process you're going to want with any audience, but with foundations or with funders, you have a little more evidence typically of that because they have a footprint out in the world. That's got to get translated into that value problem solution action. And you get to include both, right? They get to see the deficit, if that's really what drives them. And they do need to understand that there's a problem you're trying to solve, but also you get to talk about the why, right? What's our vision, and what do we get as a community, as a society, as a nation, if our work is funded and it's successful.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Helen is asking, how can I help guide my non-POC colleagues in equity work without taking it on myself? She says, I find myself burning out as I act as a resource. Any tips on that?
Yeah, Helen, look, if I knew the answer to that, I would be in a different line of work. But I can tell you that, finding the validators out in the world can be really important, right? So, and connecting them, right? So thinking about, okay, where does, the colleagues that I work with, where are they going for their information? What do they seem to respect in terms of sources? And what are the resources, the folks within that world who get it, right? Who get racial equity and can provide, be the Sherpas to them, if you will, to be the guides for them in ways that it can be, I feel you, can be exhausting when you're always the one who has to do it, right? And also, it's just hard to get your work done if you are constantly, having to correct, adjust, inform. You become known as that person, right? People take a breath when you raise your hand because they're worried that they're going to get lectured. So on the one hand, I think there are ways, and go back to the principles, the lessons that we just went through, for that can inform your communications when you're talking to colleagues, and I would say connect them to other places. So what do I mean as a practical matter about that? There are foundations like Kellogg and Annie Casey would be two examples that have really taken on racial equity as an internal and an external principle, and they're longstanding, well-respected foundations that can be a place to reference, right, for colleagues. There are organizations like PRI, which is the Philanthropic Race Initiative run by Lori Villarosa, that all they do is work with the philanthropic sector on better incorporating equity and race into day-to-day work. And Candid is now also a resource. There are resources in what we used to call Grantcraft. I don't know if it's still called that. That talk about this. So is that still what it's called?
Yes, that is still what it's called. Yes, Grantcraft.
Great. So, none of that solves the problem, right, of you being the one in the room who, hears something said that you can't let stand. And, you do have to make a constant, perhaps daily decision whether to take on that role or not, or, when to pick your battles. But I do find that making that connection to other folks in philanthropy, if that's the sector you work in, but whatever your sector is, who are getting it right, and the resources to do it can be important. And ultimately, that's a question of values and and solution. So those are my initial thoughts about that.
Thank you, Alan. The next question is from Danielle. And she wants to know if you found success uniting multiple minority groups within a social justice nonprofit organization. So, for example, LGBTQ, Black and Latino, interconnected narratives with class structures and healthcare inequalities.
Yeah, so I have. I mean, I don't know that I can take credit for any that are out there, although we certainly aspire to do that in our organization and our work. But an example might be BAJI, for example, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration in the Bay Area. Very intersectional organization that's working, as the name suggests, both on issues of race affecting people of African descent, immigration policy. They're thinking about healthcare. They're thinking about criminal justice and law enforcement. Their leadership has consistently, consisted both of queer leaders and leaders who were focusing, making sure that the work was focused in part on the intersectional challenges facing LGBTQ communities who are immigrants and African diaspora. So, I think the leadership piece is really important, and I have definitely seen that happen. And I think there are a lot of examples. I mean, most of them, not surprisingly, tend to be millennial organizations. In other words, organizations that were created in the last decade and are for which the driving force is millennials. Most of the organizations in the movement for Black Lives are working in that way. A lot of the newer Dreamer-led immigrant rights organizations, UndocuQueer is an example. So I think there are quite a few examples of that, and I think a crucial piece, and this kind of goes back to Jonathan's question at the beginning, is collaborative leadership from the start. It's very difficult to go back and diversify your movement or effort after the fact if it didn't begin with that set of values. It can be done, it has been done, but it's much more difficult.
That relates to the next question from Lauren. She's working for an organization that serves people from majority marginalized communities. And however, her board of directors are overwhelmingly white and come from privileged backgrounds. And so, her question again is, how does one start this conversation with nonprofit, with leaders when they are very disconnected to the communities that they are serving?
Yeah. So, one way is thinking about, presumably your organization, Lauren, already has some ways of familiarizing your board with the work, right? So, that might be a board committee that's reporting, it might be staff reports, what have you. An important vehicle is figuring out some other more engaging, more multicultural ways to do that. Like how can they meet some of the folks that that you work with, multicultural communities, in a way that is not rarefied and highly unequal and hierarchical, but actually is an exchange of information and ideas and cultural experience. Can you bring board members to a community rather than having folks you work with stand and deliver in front of board members? What's the storytelling that you can do, and what images are you picking? Who are you? Are there multimedia ways to give them a better sense? And then, of course, is building the board itself. So really kind of taking on as a benchmark, building a diverse board that hits the things that boards need to hit. If it's fundraising, if it's a fundraising board, understanding of organizational dynamics and finance and the like. But not every board member needs to understand every one of those things. I've never encountered a board in which that was the case. So being proactive about diversifying the board, and then making sure again that the conversations are structured in a way that gives everyone agency and equal voice, rather than kind of having special board members that are from the community and then the real board members. I have also seen that, and that's really can be more harmful, do more harm than good. So those are two different strategies. How do you take your existing board, which is not diverse and is privileged, and better educate them, and then how do you change the board over time? And there are some good resources out there for help in diversifying boards.
Thank you, Ellen. And I also do want to share that we just recently did a webinar on the topic of using non-governing boards to help diversify your leadership. You can find this, the recording of this webinar on GrantSpace. It is available for free. So I would encourage you, Lauren, to look into this resource to at least help with the diversification of the leadership in your organization. The next question here is from Taylor, and he wants to know, they want to know, Alan, could you speak more about the importance of leadership and how we can elevate this via VPSA to supporters?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. If you could speak more about the importance of leadership and how we can elevate this via VPSA to supporters.
Okay, well, let me take a stab at that, and Taylor, if
Sure.
you want to further clarify while I'm talking, I'm not positive that I fully understand the question. So one of the leadership principles that I mentioned is lifting up and supporting the voices of people who are directly affected by, in this instance, racial inequity, or our criminal justice system, or problems with our immigration system, or what have you. So I do think that's important, and folks need to be prepared and supported to do that. In terms of the kind of moving the value, problem, solution, action messaging amongst supporters, there's a bunch of ways to do that. So one is kind of your own scan of your organization's communications. What does your website look like? What does your annual report look like? What images are you using? Those are the ways that, what does your social media stream look like? Now that, for better and worse, there's, more characters in Twitter, we actually have room to do a full-on VPSA on Twitter. So first is, how are you talking to your various audiences, whether they're supporters or, folks you're trying to convince? And are you reflecting that value, problem, solution, action structure and some of the other principles that we talked about? And then for folks who are actually part of your, who are your support base, bring folks in and talk about how this structure can be more helpful. Use our website. We actually have a social justice communications toolkit, which is includes racial equity. It's not solely about racial equity, but it has all these lessons. It has the VPSA. It uses flashcards. So that's a way to do it. If you have more time, we will sometimes do an online survey of our constituents, our network, to see what values are most important to them, to see what they're struggling with in talking about our work or their issues or our organization. And then we'll generate a bunch of VPSA flashcards and share them with them and say, hey, does this help or is it useless? What do you wish you had? We do that with our own board, where we kind of walk through with them. An organization like ours that works behind the scenes, it's often hard to tell our story and why diversity and racial equity in particular is so important to our work. And so, we're constantly producing and trying out materials. So let me stop there. Hopefully that was responsive, Taylor, to your question, but I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, he already submitted a follow-up, so I appreciate that, Taylor. In the follow-up, they clarify, I find it sometimes that it's hard for supporters to understand why they should support leadership development versus direct service, and how we bring donors and stakeholders into the work in a way that helps them understand the importance of equity-focused leadership development.
Got it.
Is that
Okay.
helpful?
So I didn't answer your question at all, Taylor. I think a primary answer is most of those audiences that are skeptical need examples. They need to see how it makes a difference. They need to, and it needs to be kind of a story arc, right? We were doing, here's somebody or a group that was doing their work in a particular way, and they were doing okay, they were making some progress, but there was something missing, and they incorporated leadership development specifically around, diverse voices and diversity as a principle and a goal, and here's what they were able to accomplish. And so, I don't know what sector you're in, Taylor, but, finding examples that are, comparable is important. So PolicyLink, for example, in the Bay Area, they're headquartered in the Bay Area, but they're a national organization. They have lots of examples about how diversity and lifting up leaders and what works has resulted in transformative change that could not have occurred by doing business, the old ways of doing business. But the other thing is we can't assume that our audiences will connect all the dots. So you actually have to tell them the whole story, right? It's not, we would hope that it's enough just to say, look at this amazing leader and the amazing outcome. But in fact, with, audiences that are 3s and 4s on that scale, you actually have to explain to them how it was done, not in a condescending way, but in a, in a way that respects their experience, but shares some new ideas with them. So I hope, excuse me, hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. The next is a shout out from Susan, who says, "Thank you. This was very interesting and inspiring and well presented." Thank you, Susan, for tuning in and being with us today. And we hope that you will come back to a future program.
Yeah, thanks for me as well.
Aisha, yes, Aisha has also followed up. She asked the earlier question about how would you, what communication strategies are there when your work focuses on equity in young children. So her follow-up is, she says that they run a program that is designed to support the development of positive racial identity in young African American children ages 3 to 8. And while our message about the ways race and racism impact young children has been generally well received, we haven't been able to reach a sizable audience with that message. Any
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a really helpful clarification, Aisha. Thank you. I mean, so a few thoughts are, part of my answer to Taylor is the same, right, for you, which is often people need to see the positive outcome. That there's a reason why you've come upon this approach and why you've decided it's important. And so you kind of need to figure out, well, what does my audience value? And, is there an overlapping set of values? It might be empowerment, but it might be, educational achievement, or it might be, greater community health, or, cohesive communities, or what have you. So part of it is that. Part of it is really segmenting your audiences carefully. So, I know, as I'm sure you do, lots of folks for whom that goal really resonates, right? The positive images, self-image for young people of color. And so, let's make sure that part of your communications and outreach is with those folks who will immediately get that. So, I think about people in the field of social psychology and race, which is, what I studied as an undergrad, and they get that immediately, right? Not everybody in social psychology gets it, but the people who study self-esteem and success, psychological success, and health for young people of color will immediately get that. So what can be done with that audience, which is your base, to try to bring in and explain to other audiences that may be more skeptical? Maybe you have an audience coming from a public health perspective. And so hearing from other social scientists who are looking at the issue that, yeah, there's a ton of research and experience showing that this is crucial to the success of young people and young adults throughout their lives in multiple ways that have been studied and documented. That might be one approach. It depends who your audience is, right? It might be that there's a faith-based approach. So, I would recommend actually doing a map of the highest priority audiences who you want to reach. Where do they fit? Like, who might be the base, and who's, are they 1, 2, 3s, 4s, or 5s? And then, actually think about who your influencers are potentially, and who your as well as who your decision makers are. And, that sometimes that tells you, wow, I've really got a lot of work to do. But it often will make your job a lot easier, because, again, you're not trying to convince everybody. You're trying to convince some specific folks, and they are persuaded, but they hold a particular set of values which are determinable by you, and they are persuaded by particular types of arguments. So that's my thinking, Aisha, about that, and best of luck, because I know how important that work is that you're doing.
Thank you, Alan. We have many more questions, but I'd like to take a very quick break right now just to make our audience aware of two very special opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is part of our live online training, Altogether Now, Conversations in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is a series that has been going on since last year. And so if this is your first time tuning in and joining us, we do invite you to catch up with our series. We have all of the recordings of all of our past webinars available on GrandSpace, and we invite you to check out in particular, one called Reframing the Story, Investment in Black Men and Boys is Vital for Whole Community Health. This training discusses the importance of redirecting philanthropic investments for justice-oriented collective action and impact, and how that translates in the real world. You will learn about the 7 elements of the paid in full investment strategy and how to apply this approach to your work as a grant maker, a nonprofit, government, or a community-based entity. Also, learn how to foster inclusion and collaboration with our self-paced e-learning course, Diversity and Inclusion, Walking the Talk. Explore strategies that advance racial equity and inclusion in foundations and their partners, and gain the ability to foster reflection and shift from reactive problem solving to co-creating proactive solutions. So now we're going to return back to our questions, and we continue to invite our audience to submit more questions. We do still have some time left here. The next question is from Savannah, and she wants to know, as a smaller organization, how do we get a strong understanding of where our primary constituents are on the 1 to 5 relatability scale for a given topic? For example, such as our work with racial equity as one piece of our organizational work. So how do we understand this so that we can engage them better, is her question.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for that, Savannah. I think there are a few different ways. So some is, as I said in my answer to Aisha, mapping what you know, right? So let's actually write out with as much specificity as possible who are those folks who we're really trying to reach. And just that conversation amongst the people in your small organization can be really enlightening, because sometimes people aren't all on the same page in terms of who's most important to reach and persuade or activate. So, doing that map, then setting out what you do know, right? So like I've been speaking to these folks, or, at our clinic, here's what we keep hearing, or, I know that this faith community has always been a particular ally, and that's because they care about, this set of things. Write all of that stuff out. And so that's the free part, right? That just requires time. And then, there's some resources that are cheap or free to get, a better sense of some of the other audiences. So, if you have a client base or a existing donor base, or a, base of supporters, or an email chain, you can do a free survey on using SurveyMonkey, or there's a number of other free services where you're asking them, ask them at most 10 questions about their priorities, how they feel on a scale of 1 to 5 on a couple of the issues that you are where you're really not sure where they're coming at this. That's and then they can answer that anonymously, and you can get that back. Those are people who you already have some kind of relationship with, right? So you can ask them to do that and reasonably expect that they're going to do it. You can look at existing surveys that local newspapers have done, or that organizations like the Gallup polls have done. There's an organization called Public Agenda that keeps a lot of polls and resources. We do that for immigration. So if you're an organization that works with immigrants or on immigrant rights, we have a lot of that data. We don't have it for every jurisdiction by any means, but at the national and state level, we have a lot of that. You can look in social media. You can do a search on Twitter, for example, of search words, and see what comes up and get a sense from that. So those are all basically free ways that you can, do some of the groundwork there. And then you can also do focus groups, which you can do informally or pay for. You can do a full-on survey, even if they're policymakers. There are outfits that you can, hire to do a set of interviews with policymakers on multiple sides of the issue you work on. That starts to get, more expensive. And so, you should be thinking about the full range of possibilities, and maybe you can do the cheaper free ones now and aspire or fundraise to do the more expensive ones, if you really think that it can give you a step up in your impact and success.
Thank you, Alan. This next question is from Marcia. Marcia is a community organizer in Boston. She wants to advocate for her community because she believes that they are getting marginal services, given that it's becoming increasingly diverse, essentially less white, with more immigrants. She says that they have a neighborhood group, but the folks in the group are largely unaware or are in denial of the trends that she's seeing in the community, and these trends being less services, no commercial revitalization. What should her messaging be, and who should she start with? Is her question. Any tips on that?
Yeah. So a few thoughts, Marcia. One is, and I lived in the Boston area a long time ago, and I was just there this past weekend and was stunned at the changes, both the gentrification in some places, like Somerville, where I used to live, and the diversity, the greater diversity in other parts. So I think one thing is some of that systemic storytelling that I described to you, the map, for example. There are the Boston Fed actually has some interesting data on trends on economic inequality in the Boston metro area, and there are a few other organizations that have that. And then you want to kind of do that same intel that I was talking about in response to Savannah's question, which maybe it sounds like you can do. You don't need a ton of research because it sounds like you're already interacting with some of these folks. Think about who can I persuade and get as an ally early. So who are the ones and the twos, and let's start with them. And let's think about the twos who know some threes and fours and get some intel from them. So I don't know, because I don't know what neighborhood you're in or whether you're in Boston proper. I'm not sure where you should start, but I think that typically you want to start with the folks who are most likely to get it, but who are connected to people who don't, right? So if it's a city council or a neighborhood council, is there a member or two who you think is already likely to be on your side, and does he, she, or they have some insights into people who maybe are not? Excuse me. Boston area, you have university-based resources that most of the rest of the country doesn't have access to. So those are all typically, not always, they're typically good places to go because you can find scholars and practitioners at almost any university that will, that understand and are worried about the changing dynamics in Boston and the unresponsiveness of state and local government to those changes. So that's a little general. I apologize because I don't know too much about the specifics of where you're working, but that's almost always a good way to go to start with the kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will. I think the important thing, though, is with an eye towards an ever-increasing audience that is reaching decision makers and influencers who are more skeptical, because sometimes we'll get comfortable talking only with the people who already agree with us, and then unless you're very lucky, that's not going to be enough to make real change. So if you think of it as like concentric circles where you're starting with folks who get it, but you have a shared strategy to reach and persuade people who don't.
Thank you, Alan. We have a question here from Shanisha, and she wants to know, she says that she works for a small research consulting firm focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. She wants to know, how can her company communicate their services on social media without intimidating audiences? Any thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting question. Without intimidating audiences. I don't know if that means intimidating them with the technical nature of what you all do or the cost or what. So I'm not sure where to go beyond the overarching principles I've described, but I guess I think, Shanisha, that this is, as you probably know, demand for real data and evidence-based knowledge on equity, diversity, and inclusion is on the rise. And so, really figuring out who your target audiences are, and then the case studies, right? So I don't know how long you all have been around, but I think as you've seen on this call and the people who posted questions, everybody's looking for practical success stories that they can point to persuade their colleagues to raise money, to be able to say, hey, this, not only is this important, but it works and it benefits everybody. And so I think your ability to tell those stories are important. And obviously social media, you're limited in the storytelling you can do. You should always be linking back to additional resources. But I think what it means, for example, is, what are the images that you're choosing? So if you're, posting something, if you're posting something on Facebook or Instagram, is, to our earlier question, is it about the contribution model, right? Does it picture success? Or is it just a generic photo or a photo that's only about the problem? If you're, if you're tweeting, are you including at the very least a value, shared value, a summarized solution, and a link, which is the action? That's absolutely crucial. So I'm, if you want to type in more about the intimidation part, I'm happy to try to think that through. I'm not sure precisely what you mean by that, but those are my thoughts so far.
So Shanisha just submitted a clarification, and she says definitely the technical nature. So it seems that she was referring to the technical nature of the work we do. Yes.
Got it. Yeah. So I mean, I think you need to show and tell how your work helps folks through it, right? So without myth busting, right? So you don't want to tell people, hey, are you intimidated by the difficult nature of this technical piece? But rather, here's how we make it easy, or here's how we, help you knock down obstacles to greater inclusion and equity. Here are people who we, who we worked with to solve problems in their community. And you want to have show the diversity of folks you're working with, including people who share share characteristics with the audiences you're trying to attract, who you think are perhaps intimidated by the complexity. So what's the small community group that you helped? What is the local school district that you helped, or the small the medium-sized business? I think those, and can those folks who you've been helpful to, are they willing to be a voice in support? Because that's going to go a long way. And that's true just like at the Yelp level, right? If folks are saying good things about you on social, about their experiences with you on social, including this was we have a small shop, but they really helped us to understand and act on the data that was available, and and produce concrete solutions that helped everyone. That's going to go a long way.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to everyone that submitted their questions. We are out of time, but this was a wonderful discussion, and I think there's definitely a lot for us to chew on and digest. And we just want to thank you all for attending today's webinar and being a part of this great conversation. So on behalf of our team here at Candid, first of all, again, deeply appreciate your participation in our webinar series, Alan. This was great. Thank you so much. And if you liked this webinar, we hope that you will join us again soon. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks so much.